you. Can everybody hear me back there? Okay. So thank you for inviting me, Pat, and it's wonderful to be down here, and I hope that you get something out of my presentation. So I'm going to be talking about engaging the community living with spinal cord injury, and obviously I have a spinal cord injury myself, so this is very near and dear to my heart. So let's go ahead and get into it. The two main parts of my talk are going to initially talk about a large body of my work, which is around identifying the functions and topics of highest priority to the people actually living with spinal cord injuries. That's where the research needs to have an impact. And then I will get into describing some of the strategies that we are starting to employ to engage people with spinal cord injuries along the process of translation. And I'll describe that in more detail. So, engagement in research. What is that, really? We know easily, okay, we ask people to be participants in our research studies, but there's a lot more to it than that. People with a disease or with a condition, people with spinal cord injuries, they can be instrumental in identifying the topic that should be studied. They can be involved in the grant development and in the review process, in the design of studies, in the conduct of studies, members of the research team, and in the dissemination of results. And in the little graphic diagram there, you can see some examples of where you can include people with spinal cord injuries in the research process. Why do we need to do that? Number one, it can help guide research to be more consumer-oriented. And that will hopefully make it more clinically relevant and useful to people out in the communities. And it is really important to be able to enhance trust in between researchers, between the people that are being studied, people that are being involved, and also between the clinical community. And if you can increase trust, you can probably improve uptake, which is what we want to happen in the end. So, let's talk about some of the functions and topics that we know are of high priority to people living with spinal cord injuries. And I'll start out with the work that Pat alluded to. It's actually been 15 years ago now. I was in the basic science research realm, and I was seeing that most of the studies were involving rats, obviously, but they were getting thoracic spinal cord injuries, and they were looking at walking. And I knew that there were a lot more problems with spinal cord injury than just not being able to walk. So I did a survey of people with spinal cord injuries, and I asked them to rank these different functions and to be what would be the most impactful in your quality of life. And to the clinical community, it might be obvious what the results are. So people with cervical level injuries said that regaining arm and hand function was most important to them. And people with paraplegia said that sexual function was most important to them. And this was a little bit eye-opening to the basic science community, but it's helped to shift the areas of research in that realm so that they can start addressing things that are more important to people with spinal cord injuries. It's also important to know that there are shared priorities. So in the black bar is bladder and bowel control, and the white bar is sexual function related to different levels of injury. The autonomic functions are really high priority across injury levels. And this is important because almost any level or severity of spinal cord injury is going to have some kind of autonomic dysfunction. And when those autonomic functions are not working or not being managed or controlled, they can destroy your life. So we really need to look at those different areas. And there are relationships between autonomic function, bladder, bowel, sexual function. There's relationships there that we'll talk about more in a minute. And improving walking function was not equally rated across the injury levels. So don't get me wrong, everybody with spinal cord injury wants to be able to walk again, but that's the easy part of being paralyzed. And it's all of the other things that are really impacting your daily life. So after that survey, a few of my colleagues and I went on and did another survey that is more in detail about sexual activity and sexual function. And I'm not going to be able to go into it because it actually produced 3 different papers. But some of the highlights are in our population that we surveyed, we were interacting with people that were in sexual relationships pre-injury and in post-injury. And about 60% of the people were in a sexual relationship when they took the survey. But the majority said that their spinal cord injury had altered the way that they view themselves sexually. And improving their sexual function would have a big impact on their quality of life. And this is something that people don't like to talk about. And particularly rehabilitation people don't really like to talk about it that much. And certainly basic scientists don't like to talk about it. But it's something that impacts everybody. And it's something that you can do to change people's lives. Now, there are some relationships between sexual activity and autonomic dysfunction and autonomic dysreflexia. Does the room in general know what autonomic dysreflexia is? Okay. So about a third of the respondents in that survey reported experiencing AD during sexual activity, and they said that it was an interference. Now, some people may say that they use AD in a positive factor, but there is still a large portion that says it's interfering. What was interesting was people that had AD during their bladder or bowel care was a predictor that they would experience AD during their sexual activity as well, and that it would be interfering. What we don't know in our population is how prevalent is this concept of silent AD. That's where you're having the cardiovascular changes that are dangerous, but you're not feeling the symptoms. And we don't know how prevalent is malignant AD, and that's where you get rid of the stimulus, but you're still having those cardiovascular problems. And we know absolutely nothing about the long-term repercussions of repeated dysreflexia episodes. So people can live 20, 30, 40, even 50 years with a spinal cord injury. And throughout those years, they may experience hundreds or more episodes of dysreflexia. And what is that doing to the vasculature in the brain, particularly? But this is a wonderful opportunity for research involving the human experience and merging that with our animal models that we know about the mechanisms underlying dysreflexia. And if we can impact dysreflexia in one realm, say in bladder care, it's likely it can also translate into an impact in bowel and sexual activity as well. And there are many other groups that over the years that have published similar results on what functions are most important to people with spinal cord injury. Bladder or bowel and sexual function go up there in almost every study. Motor control related to what your injury level is there. And I didn't talk about it here, but pain is a very important problem to people living with spinal cord injuries, and particularly the longer that you live with a spinal cord injury. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about some new studies related to bladder and bowel control. This is an activity that came out of a meeting that the Nielsen Foundation held in 2017, specific to bladder and bowel function and spinal cord injury. Out of that meeting, neuromodulation was considered one of the most low-hanging fruits for targets for intervention for spinal cord injury and bladder and bowel, so they developed a working group. Well, the working group decided, we need to know more from people with spinal cord injuries before we can make some recommendations. So the working group was led by Dr. Dennis Bourbeau, and there were several people at the workshop that are part of that working group. But then a new organization was developed around the same time period called the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. I'll tell you more details about that when we get into the second half of the talk. But the consortium identified people with spinal cord injuries that could become members of this working group and really contribute the SCI perspective for what they wanted to do. So what they ended up doing was co-developing a survey to better understand the needs and priorities of people with SCI on managing their bladder and bowel care, and to identify what are their attitudes on potential nerve stimulation or neuromodulation approaches for bladder and bowel care. So a couple highlights. I'm not going to go into everything, and this survey is in the process of being published, so you'll be able to read it more. So when we asked people about their priorities for bladder function and what they want improved, and they were asked to rank these in order of most importance to them, being free of medical complications related to bladder was number 1, followed by being able to empty your bladder without catheters, without having to use a catheter, and then maintaining urinary continence. These were the 3 most important things related to bladder care. And similarly, related to bowel care, being able to be continent was very important, having a predictable bowel routine, and actually reducing the amount of time that it takes to do the bowel routine. These are the 3 most important characteristics to improve. So that gives you some targets of where to go. Then they asked them about some different examples of neuromodulation. And these cartoons show you 2 different types, a generic external stimulation and a generic internal stimulation system. So they were given descriptions about these 2 general things. They didn't talk about any one product in particular. They just want to know about the concepts. And they were also given information about different risks and benefits related to an external stimulation device versus an internal stimulation device. So obviously, internal device involves surgery and other risks there. So a couple examples of the results that they got here. This one is, if you could empty your bladder through your urethra without having to have a catheter, how likely would you be to accept an external or an internal nerve stimulation system? And the way that this graph is set up is on the x-axis on the bottom is the percentage of responses. And people rated on a Likert scale from 1 to 7. So 1 was very likely, that's the dark blue. 7 was not likely, that's the dark red. And 4 was somewhat likely or unsure, and that's the gray. So you'll start to see several graphs that are looking like this based on the Likert scale. So you can see if you could empty your bladder without having to deal with catheters, that's very, very important to people, and they're likely to accept both types of devices. And you'll see there's a little bit less interest in the internal stimulation device, but that's healthy because that comes with more risk, so you'd want people to think more about that. And then another question that they asked in relation to bowel control, if you could be fecally continent, how likely would you to accept an external device or an internal device? And there's even more interest when it comes to bowel control. And so there will be more data coming out about that in the publication. Another example of where what's important to people and how you can get their input is asking about the design of different devices. So this is a study that we did a couple of years ago, and it was really related to brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface devices for spinal cord injury, particularly for cervical spinal cord injury. They showed people these different diagrams of different potential brain-computer interface devices or brain-machine interface devices. And in circle there are the 2 completely internalized systems. Those were the most highly preferred designs. And because people worry or care about what things are kind of sticking out of them or what people see, because people tend to stare at things that are not normal or different. So the internalized systems were what people preferred. And when coming to what the application would be, they asked about, okay, if you're going to use a device to control typing, to control a cursor on a computer, to control an external device, or to actually control your own limb. People prefer the ability to control their own limb. And it doesn't have to be perfect control. It can be some arm control, some hand movement. But lastly, up to 60% of the people said that they would be willing to undergo a neurosurgical procedure to actually have a device that would improve their upper extremity function. So we have to start thinking about risk in relation to the benefit that they're going to get. Okay. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what we're starting to learn related to risk versus benefit for spinal cord injury. So this is another study that I did several years ago, and it's related to tendon transfer surgeries for upper extremity function. 2 most common ones are for tricep function, so you can either do bicep to tricep tendon transfer or posterior deltoid to tricep tendon transfer. And then the other most common one is to get pinch strength in your hand. So when we asked people with cervical injuries, would you be willing to undergo a surgery for about a 30% increase in your elbow extension strength? That's about what a tricep transfer will do. About 2/3 of the people said yes, they would be willing to undergo surgery for that type of a benefit. And a third said no. The gray here are people that already have that tricep function. We're talking about all cervical level injuries. Similarly, with a finger to thumb type of tendon transfer, you can usually get about a 50% increase in your function. And many people were very interested in having surgery for that. Now, you may or may not know, but tendon transfers come with a trade-off. There's a bit of a recovery period. And so we asked people, would you be willing to actually be less independent in that 2 to 3 months that you're recovering from your tendon transfer, with the hope that after that you'll be able to be more independent? And usually there's immobilization of the arm required for a couple months. And majority of people, 75%, said yes. If I'm going to be able to be more independent in the long run, I'm willing to take that risk and that trade-off in the early part to be more dependent on people. And then we asked people, well, what's the ideal time to have this? And during the first 5 years post-injury is the ideal time to go through that type of a surgical procedure. Another area that is, I actually didn't publish on, this is by Judy Isles out of Canada. She did some focus groups to ask people about their preferences and readiness for cellular therapies. So we hear a lot about stem cell therapies, and the public hears a lot about stem cell therapies. And there are risks related to that. Usually, most of the surgeries involve injection into the spinal cord, which comes with a pretty significant risk. So they asked people in the different focus groups about their risk tolerance to different things. And you can see in the upper graph there, the thoracic injury cohort, their quotes there tend to be more on the risk tolerant side. If you go down to the cervical injury cohort, they tend to be more on the risk adverse side. And in the last 5 to 10 years or so, the clinical trials that are testing cellular therapies have been shifting to cervical injuries. And the reason for that is because it's a little bit easier to detect functional changes in the cervical spinal cord than it is in the thoracic spinal cord. But you need to be aware of that. You're going towards a group that is more worried about risk. They're worried about loss of function. And so that could impact the way that enrollment goes in those clinical trials. Another new study that I just published this year is related to risk-benefit preferences for an implanted neurotechnology. And this is a device that is using functional electrical stimulation, but it's completely implanted, completely internalized. And the technology actually allows you to do multiple functions. Depending on where you put the electrodes, you could look at improving arm function, and you could also look at improving trunk function. Those are the two areas that they're studying in an early feasibility trial right now. Well, we wanted to know for a pivotal trial later on, what are people thinking about the risks related to this type of a device? And then what about the potential benefits? So the risks could be broken down into those that are in the first 30 days post-surgery. So that includes things like a post-surgical infection, temporary post-surgical pain, having to have your arm immobilized for a little while, having to limit the number of transfers you're doing if you're implanting the trunk for a little while. And you can see that people are concerned about post-surgical infections, and they're worried about pain and the temporary immobilizations, but they know that those are temporary, and so they're not major barriers to participation. There's also risks that could really happen within the first 5 years, and these are more around the implanted components in the implanted device. So it's completely internalized system, so that makes troubleshooting a little bit more difficult. So if something goes wrong, you may have to do a surgical procedure to correct it. So we asked people at the very top of that graph, the least risky problem. If you had a problem with the implant and it could be corrected without having to have surgery, yes, people are not concerned about that. That's the strong blue bars. At the very bottom of that graph is the most risky procedure, and that's where you have a problem with the implant that requires removal of the whole system. For example, if the components got infected on a large body-wide basis. That is extremely risky, and people are very, very aware of that. And if they have to go down that problem, they don't want to, that would really impact their choice on getting the device. Now, luckily, those kinds of risks, the most severe ones, are very low in the likelihood of happening. But this gives us some gauge in what people are thinking. Then we also ask them about, well, what kind of a success do you think is a success? We know from the history of the device that it can do a lot of things, and this is related to arm function. So we gave people a definition of success. Success would mean that you get an active improvement in your arm, that you improve the ability to pinch or to grasp things with your hand, and you gain the ability to move more everyday objects than before. So with all of those things in mind, how likely would you be in this device if you could get a 90% chance of success, 80% chance going down, 65%, all the way down to a 10% chance of success? And you can see all the way down to just a 50% chance of success. People are very interested in a device that would provide that kind of a function. So it's not just about risks by themselves and benefits by themselves. It's about the whole package. People are making decisions. And for what level of risk are they willing to take for what degree of function? This also leads into what we can get from information from people about clinical trial design. This is important because there's a lot of aspects that impact enrollment, and that impacts clinical trials significantly. And it's really dangerous for researchers to think that everybody with that injury level or with that disease is actually going to participate in a trial, because that's just not the case. But for spinal cord injury, we need to be really proactive about this, because there are a lot of different strategies that are being tested, not just cells and drugs, but rehabilitation interventions, device interventions, educational interventions. But in order to get these really out to the population, you're going to have to do large trials. And that means you're going to have large numbers of people. It means you're going to have multiple sites, and may actually need to be multinational. So the inclusion and the exclusion criteria are one issue. But what about all those people that do qualify and they decide they don't want to be part of the trial? What do? We need to understand that. So we did an international survey to identify what are the factors that are influencing people's decisions to participate. And we asked people about 32 different factors. These factors came from the literature. There's a lot of information about this actually in cancer clinical trials. So we drew from that, and we drew from our multinational team. We ended up analyzing the data into as many different subgroups as you could think of. Okay, is gender having an impact? Is injury level making impacting decisions? Current age at the time that they took the survey, their injury duration, and their country of residence. So we actually found out that there were some universal factors. And what the definition of a universal factor in our criteria was that 50% or more of all 17 of those subgroups chose the same category for that factor. And we grouped them into facilitator, barrier, or a neutral factor. And that's based on a Likert scale of what we asked them. From -1 to -3, this would have a negative impact on my decision, and +1 to +3 would have a positive impact on my decision. So here's an example of the universal factors. And again, number of responses is on the bottom. And blue are facilitators, red are barriers, and gray is neutral. So you can see that there are some really strong facilitators. And obviously, the obvious ones are if someone has a likelihood of getting an improvement in their function or improvement or their independence, you would think that that would be a strong facilitator. But also just the fact that when they're in a clinical trial, they actually increase their knowledge. They increase their knowledge about their spinal cord injury, about their health, and that turned out to be a really strong facilitator. Altruism is extremely strong in the spinal cord injury realm. So even though the individuals in the trial may not benefit, if they think that giving up their body can help other people in the future, that's a very strong facilitator. As well as having strong family support, that's critical. And also getting recommendation from their peers and from their personal physicians. So for recruitment, that means you should be including peer groups or peer support, peer organizations. You should also be reaching out to the personal physician level out in the healthcare system. Now there's also some strong barriers, and the two obvious ones are they could have a potential decrease in their function or adverse effect. But another strong barrier is potential impact on their income or on the medical coverage. Their potential impact on income could be if they have to take time off of work or their family members have to take time off of work to come and participate in the trial. But there's also a fear that if somebody improves their function a little bit, but not enough, they're going to actually lose their qualification for their medical coverage. And you know that that is really critical to a lot of people. And the small amount of income that people receive from their disabilities is really restricted by a lot of other things. And so this is something to really think about. And then potential out-of-pocket expenses are big barriers. So transportation to get back and forth to a location. Or if they need to be at a location for a week or a couple weeks to do testing, what does that mean for attendant care and costs related to that? And then there were some neutral factors such as religion, privacy, and prior experience with clinical trials. So in summary of this first part here, we know a lot of information about what functions are of high priority to people living with spinal cord injury. So we know a lot about where we can target our interventions. We're starting to understand how people weigh different benefits and risks with specific to certain functional targets. And that's really important to hone in on. Listening to people with spinal cord injury can really help prioritize our drug targets. It can help our engineering design decisions, improve devices, can help with troubleshooting, can help with clinical trial design, and it can help with our functional targets. And importantly, regulators are starting to listen to what the community is saying. The FDA will now take what they call patient preference data and include that in their decision when they're making an assessment of a product that's coming out onto the market. And they review that in addition to their clinical and safety information from clinical trials. So this is really, really important, and the FDA is actually making, they're actually investing in this as well. So now let's go into some strategies to employ consumer engagement across the spectrum of translational research. Let's start out with just a little refresher of what this spectrum of translation is, because translation can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. What I'm talking about when I talk about translation, I'm talking about this T0 to T4 continuum. T0 is the basic science research, and in spinal cord injury, there is a significant amount of investment in basic science research, particularly from NIH. There's pretty good amount of T2 research in spinal cord injury, and that's where a lot of the rehabilitation research would fall under, and clinical research. This is where you're doing small studies, like a single center study. You're looking at a small subpopulation of people with spinal cord injuries, and you're looking at how that, what's the efficacy in that subpopulation. there's really not a lot of translational research to the practice or to the communities in spinal cord injury. It's really been lacking in this area. And I think a big part of that is because you need partnerships. You need partnerships between the academicians that are really focused on these early phases of research, T0, T1, and you've got to get it out to the communities to get to T3 and T4 research. And the community is not just people living with spinal cord injuries. It's all of you guys. It's all of the healthcare providers, and it's the healthcare systems. So we need to start to create partnerships, and that involves exchange of knowledge. So at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, a consortium was created, and this is a North American SCI consortium. I'll call it NASCIC for short. And this really was born out of a meeting in 2016 in Canada that the Rick Hansen Institute held, and they're focused on spinal cord injury research in Canada. But they were really trying to look at how do we get clinical trials up to at least past the approval phase of the FDA. And that's one valley of death, going from a clinical research arena to an approved device or an approved drug. But there's another valley of death, which is where you're getting out to the community. And so a lot of things fail in that first valley of death and never even have a chance to get out to the community. So the researchers at that meeting said, we need more input from people with spinal cord injuries. And so there were several of us there at the meeting, me included, and we decided to do something about it. Now, the spinal cord injury community, you might hear it being referred to as being fractured or very disparate and not unified. But I actually think that that's an asset. Our diversity is an asset because there are so many things wrong with spinal cord injury that all of the different organizations, large and small, regional, national, they need to be working on all of these different things, and it's too much for one group to try to work on all of it. And so the consortium was developed to really be an umbrella organization for all the individuals living with spinal cord injury and their families and all the different types of organizations that they lead. And most of them are nonprofit organizations. And they're working on the local, the regional, and the national level across all of the countries and territories that make up North America. An interesting fact, North America is not just the United States and Canada. It also includes Mexico, Central America, all of the Caribbean, and Greenland. And so we really need to do things on that kind of a regional or geographically regional area. And what do? We try to facilitate communication. We try to share resources amongst all of the different groups and enhance collaborations so that we can improve research, care, cure, and policy on all of those different levels. And that's really, really broad mission. So how can we help? We have been able to start to establish effective partnerships. And those are partnerships between our community and between all the other stakeholders in the research realm and in the whole translational research realm. So from researchers to governments to healthcare providers and to industry. And what I like to say is we're trying to connect the dots across that spectrum of translation. And we're in the very early infancy stages of that. So our greatest asset is really our reach within the community, our ability to get a pulse on the community living with spinal cord injury. These are all of the organizations that are led by people with spinal cord injury that are members of the consortium. We also have individuals that can be members, those are the patron members, and there's 140 individuals right now, and they are all very, very active people. And one person is making big changes in their different regional areas. And so collectively, we can make a lot of changes. We also have partner members, and those are the other stakeholders. So researchers, institutions, industry partners. But we're really trying to focus first on gathering our community and getting that voice out there of people living with spinal cord injuries. So some examples of some current projects. We decided to be project-oriented rather than just committee-oriented. so that we really have purpose behind what we're doing. We are one of 14 organizations in a pilot program that the FDA just started, and it's called Patient and Caregiver Connection Program. And that is where the FDA has a direct line to these different organizations to try to get input on what those disease groups are living with and what are their perspectives. And we actually just received a survey from the FDA a week ago that we are now starting to distribute through all of our partners in our network to people with spinal cord injuries, because the FDA wants to know input, particularly right now, on different medical devices that people deal with and the problems that they experience with those medical devices. We're also involved in an effort to include spinal cord injury in a new national neurologic registry that the CDC has been mandated to create under the 21st Century Cures Act. And this would be really, really good for spinal cord injury, because you may or may not know, but there really isn't a national registry for spinal cord injury. There are different organizations that get the Model Systems grants, and if you're in the Model Systems grants, then you keep part of that registry. And then there are different little regional areas. There might be some states that have registries, but nothing is complete. We really don't have a good picture on how many people in the United States are suffering from traumatic spinal cord injury and from non-traumatic spinal cord injury. And so particularly through our relationship with the United Spinal Association, they do a lot of lobbying and a lot of advocacy on the government level. They're a group of individuals from the consortium are working with the United Spinal to try to lobby to get SCI to be included in this registry. We also have a lot of different consumer advisory teams on small or large research projects. I mentioned to you already the neuromodulation for the bladder and bowel and the kind of outcomes that we're seeing after that. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit more on some of the advocacy that we've been doing this year related to research funding for spinal cord injury. So we had an opportunity in February of this year to be involved in a meeting that was organized by the NIH, particularly the NINDS, the Institute for Neurologic Disorders and Stroke. They held a meeting in February called SCI 2020, Launching a Decade for Disruption in Spinal Cord Injury Research. And one of the sessions that they created was it was titled With Us, Not For Us. They chose that name, and they also chose the phrase disruption in the name of their meeting, and we brought disruption to their meeting. The entire executive council of NASCA participated in the panel, and Sasha Repchesky is on the executive council as well. Our session, we were posed with 3 questions that they wanted us to address, and those were in relation to consumer participation in research, readiness for translation, and the balance of acute versus chronic research. And we really felt like, okay, if we're going to address these topics, we need to get input from our community. And so we did a survey. We kind of did it at the last minute, and we actually got 1,800 people to participate in 37 days. And so this was really, really indicative of how much our community wants to have their voice heard. And this is just an example in these graphs of who participated in the survey. You can see there's a very good representation of different injury levels and age groups. But most importantly, there is a large number of people that are living with chronic spinal cord injury, more than 20 years post-injury. So I'm going to give you a couple highlights on each of those 3 topics. And in respect to consumer participation in research, remember, NINDS is one of the major funders of all the basic science of spinal cord injury. So we asked people, do you feel like you need to increase your knowledge of research or to better understand the research process? And majority of people said, yes, we need to know more. And they also told us that they actually felt left out of the research process unless researchers need participants. Then they come seeking them. But people with spinal cord injuries also want to be involved in setting research priorities, and they also want to be involved in helping to design projects so that everyone can be successful. So that was really, really important to an audience that's not really used to hearing from people with spinal cord injuries, except in some of the surveys that I've been doing targeting research. Now, ready for translation. So I just told you that translation is an entire process, all the way from T0 to T4. At NINDS, they tend to think of it more of, okay, when are we ready to translate something from basic science to clinical research? So you could think of that as what is ready for translation. Or you could think of ready for translation as when are we ready to go out of research and now into the healthcare setting. And that would be more going from to T3 and T4 research. Well, we asked people with spinal cord injury, does ready for translation mean moving from animals to human? And in this, you can see the blue bar, the blue circle part. About half of people said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But see how many people were in the undecided category. And then there's a small portion that said, no, that's not what ready for translation is. On the other side is ready for translation when you move from research setting to the healthcare setting. Again, a large part said, yeah, that makes sense. A large part didn't know. And then a small portion said no. What I think is most important is actually a comment that someone entered in. We allowed open comments in the survey. And they said, I chose undecided for the first two questions because I have no idea what ready for translation means. And I think if you talk to the general public, they probably have the same statement. What are you talking about, ready for translation? What's most important is that we feel the impact of research. That's what people want to feel in our community. And so that's what we need to start doing. We need to start shooting stuff across the spectrum. And then lastly, our last topic was the balance of acute versus chronic research. And that's related to funders and such. So about half the people in the survey said they thought that current research focuses too much on acute injuries and that chronic injuries were understudied. Now, this may or may not be accurate in what is funded on acute versus chronic. Actually, NINDS didn't know what the proportion of the portfolio was with respect to acute versus chronic, but this is the perception out in the community. And it may be related to the hype that you hear in the media about these clinical trials, and many of them are for acute injuries. There's a lot of hype about stem cell trials for acute injuries. There's more information now about epidural stimulation and exoskeletons, but that's actually a little bit newer in the realm, and people feel like we need to do more and more and more in chronic injuries. And in fact, one person at a different meeting had a really good quote, and it was, if you cure the chronic, you've cured the acute, because everybody eventually becomes chronic, and that acute window is actually a really short time period. So lastly, what is the community telling us? They're actually telling us, all the different stakeholders, including the community, we're not working together right now. And we need to work together to create a successful pathway for translation. So where do we go from here? It's a pretty complicated process. How do we start to engage the community in translation? And after the SCI 2020 meeting, there was actually a lot of negative feedback from what we said, and then there was quite a bit of positive feedback too, because it was quite disruptive. So NASCIC felt like, well, in order to figure out where do we need to go, we actually need to figure out, we need to go to our community, and our community needs to tell us where do we need to go. So we are currently doing a needs assessment survey of our community, and the first, we're asking several questions, but I'm going to only show you a few. The first thing that we are asking people is about our mission. And I mentioned previously, our mission is pretty broad. We are including research, care, cure, and policy. And so we asked people to rank these different areas. And this survey is still in progress. So this is a preliminary results, but this is from over 500 people so far. So the number one ranked was cure, followed by care, then research and policy. Well, cure doesn't happen without research. So that's telling me that NASCIC still needs to do a lot of focus on the research process and engaging people in that research process. But care is also extremely important to people. But actually, as our previous speaker said, if you really want to impact change, you have to look at policy, and policy really impacts that. So we do still need to, I think NASCIC still needs to think about the whole picture here in order to be effective in the end. Another thing that we asked people about was to rank some different things that NASCIC could put its effort towards. And some of the things that we came up with are listed here. And in order of importance so far was improving access to SCI specialized clinical care. This is a big problem that the community faces. The other really important thing is improving access to available research studies and clinical trials. The other three are related to reimbursement and financial assistance. So reimbursement for therapy or continued adaptive fitness while you're out in the community, reimbursement for assistive technologies, and financial assistance for personal care attendance. And so those three, I think, will need to have more impact on the policy arena to impact finances. But this gives us some guidance. We need to focus on SCI specialized clinical care, and we need to focus on clinical trials and research studies. And we also asked people so if we need to focus on research, where in that circle of research do people want to be engaged? So you remember this diagram that I showed earlier. We asked people about these different phases in the research process. And the first area that is ranked most important right now is to be included as partners or advisors in the research team. People want to be incorporated into research teams. The second area was people want to be involved in developing methods or in designing studies that will be easier for people to participate in. Then they also want to be involved in identifying the research questions. And after that, it's the review process or the grant development process, dissemination, and then interpretation of data. So NASCIC can really work on identifying people with spinal cord injuries that could be matched to different research teams. And this could be on an individual project level, or it could be on a network level, or it could be on a broader level in identifying people to help with grant review processes. And also, as an outcome of SCI 2020, the meeting organizers came up with these 5 themes here that you see listed: improving functional recovery after SCI with assistive technology, knowledge of the full range of health impacts of chronic spinal cord injury, improving evidence for and implementation of functional recovery with neuromodulation and plasticity, accelerating research and development for therapies for repair and plasticity in the more chronic time period, and then improving care for SCI in the acute trauma setting. These are the themes that the meeting organizers have come out with, and they actually sought public comment on these. So we decided to include these in our survey and see what people with spinal cord injuries think about them. And in general, they're pretty supportive of these different themes. Now, I don't know what the meeting organizers are going to do with this yet. Are they going to put some focused efforts on funding or what? We don't know yet. But the most important thing to me actually out of this survey is we asked a question: what's the biggest challenge that you face on a daily basis with your spinal cord injury? Because when you get down to the heart of the matter, that is what is important. And this is an open comment question, and this is a word cloud right now of the results that we have seen. And the larger the words, the more frequently they are listed in the comments. And this is what people are facing. They have problems with independence, mobility, access, pain, lack of things, bladder, bowel, resources. This is what the life of people with spinal cord injury is right now. and this is what we have to change. So in summary, people living out there in the community want and need to be engaged in this translational process, all the way from the discovery of basic science out to the community implementation. And having access to research and care is very, very important to the community. So what we now need to do is start to build capacity within our community to be able to really start employing strategies to get them out and integrated into the research process and into the clinical care process. And these strategies really need to be partnerships. They can't be one-sided types of things. And they need to be with the various stakeholders. And we've got a lot of people in the game. We need to develop relationships and partnerships with scientists and the research systems, with clinicians and the healthcare systems, with funders all the way from research funders to reimbursement, and with governments from the local level to the federal level. And what's most important is to realize that people living with spinal cord injuries are the ones that have the life expertise of that. You can't teach that to anybody. And I wouldn't want to try to teach it to anybody. It's something that you just have to figure out as you're navigating your life with a spinal cord injury. But that's really critical, and it's really just as important as the medical expertise and as the research expertise. And I'd just like to end here with thanking everybody that has been involved over the years in providing their input and involvement in all the different surveys and in development of NASCIC now as to be a strategy to try to help improve change. Thank you. Questions?
Do we have any questions?
Uh-huh. Yes.
I think what I'd like to hear from you, all the folks here, are what, when we did this, why did we do this? Because it was an investment issue, right? We didn't go over that. Can you maybe talk about that just a little bit about what return on dollar has been for the NIH for 15 years?
Gosh. How many millions or potentially billions have been invested in spinal cord injury research by NIH pretty much since the 80s. That's when a lot of the research started ongoing. And let's take this issue of acute research for right now. There's been a ton of clinical trials on neuroprotective strategies, and not one of them has produced a product or a clinical intervention for spinal cord injury. Every single one of them has failed. And this is the area that we know the most on. We know most about the impact of the acute trauma and the inflammation system and everything that's happening and all these different strategies that we should be doing. And where's the outcome for the people? And this is public money. And we're all working, and if you want to be able to get people off of public health support, there should be that return on investment in the research. And we believe that it should be a more directed effort in the research. It shouldn't just be the best science floating to the top, and that's what gets funded and that's what gets done. You have to be a little more deliberate about what you're doing. So that's what we were trying to focus on.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.